The winter of 1861 in Kentucky Valley was particularly harsh, with wind that cut like a razor and snow that fell in sheets so thick they obscured everything beyond arm's length. Jonathan Pierce, a federal investigator sent from Washington, had been traveling for 3 days through increasingly inhospitable terrain. His assignment had seemed straightforward: investigate the disappearance of 2 Union couriers who had vanished while carrying sensitive military documents. But as his horse struggled through snowdrifts that reached its chest, Jonathan began to question the wisdom of continuing alone. Night was falling fast when he spotted the dim glow of lantern light through the snowfall. The Crossroads Inn stood 3 stories tall, its timber frame dark against the white landscape, chimney smoke promising warmth that Jonathan desperately needed. He dismounted with difficulty, his legs numb from cold, and led his exhausted horse to the small stable adjacent to the main building. "Evening, sir," called a voice from the shadows. A stable boy, no more than 14, emerged with a pitchfork in hand. "Terrible night to be traveling." "Indeed it is," Jonathan replied, his breath clouding before him. "I'll need lodging for the night." The boy nodded, taking the reins. "Mrs. Harlow will set you right. She's got rooms available. Always does this time of year." Jonathan noted something odd in the boy's tone, but attributed it to the cold and his own exhaustion. He collected his saddlebags and trudged through the snow to the inn's entrance. The heat that greeted him was almost overwhelming after the bitter cold. The main room was sparsely populated. A few men huddled near the large stone fireplace, tankards in hand. A woman of about 50 stood behind the bar, her gray-streaked hair pulled tightly back, eyes sharp as she assessed the newcomer. "Mrs. Harlow, I presume?" Jonathan approached, removing his hat. "You presume correctly," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "Looking for lodging?" "Yes, and a hot meal if possible." A strange expression flickered across her face, something like satisfaction. "You're in luck, Mr. Pierce. Jonathan Pierce. Mr. Pierce. I've just prepared a fresh batch of my special stew. It'll warm you through to the bone." She gestured to a chair near the fire. "Rest yourself. I'll bring you a bowl straight away." Jonathan settled at the indicated table, grateful for the fire's heat. He surveyed the room more carefully now. The other patrons seemed locals by their dress, yet none acknowledged each other or engaged in conversation. There was a stillness about them that struck him as peculiar. The aroma that wafted from the kitchen was rich and enticing, carrying unfamiliar spices. Mrs. Harlow returned with a steaming bowl and placed it before him along with a chunk of dark bread. "Eat up," she encouraged. "You look half frozen." As Jonathan reached for his spoon, one of the men by the fire stood suddenly and staggered toward the door. "Must be getting home," he muttered, though the storm outside had only intensified. Mrs. Harlow's smile tightened. "Certainly, Mr. Tanner, though I wouldn't recommend travel in this weather." The man paused, swaying slightly. "I've imposed too long already, ma'am." And with that, he disappeared into the swirling snow. Jonathan took his first spoonful of stew. The flavor was extraordinary, rich, complex, with a warmth that seemed to spread through his entire body. Yet beneath the savory notes lay something he couldn't identify. Metallic, almost. "This is quite unique," he remarked. Mrs. Harlow's smile widened. "Family recipe. Very old. Very special ingredients." As he continued eating, a heaviness began to settle in Jonathan's limbs, and the fire's glow seemed to intensify, colors becoming unnaturally vibrant. He blinked, trying to clear his vision. "Is everything all right, Mr. Pierce?" Mrs. Harlow asked, her voice suddenly seeming to echo. "I feel rather strange," he admitted, setting down his spoon. "Just the warmth after such cold," she assured him. "Where's your stew? Then I'll show you to your room." Jonathan looked down at the half-finished bowl, suddenly reluctant. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a winter storm. Jonathan awoke with a start, disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. His head throbbed and his mouth felt dry as cotton. The room was cold. The fire in the small hearth had died to embers hours ago. How long had he slept? He remembered finishing the stew, following Mrs. LeVay Harlow up creaking stairs and collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. Moonlight filtered through frost-covered windows, illuminating the sparse furnishings, a washstand, a chair, and the narrow bed where he now lay. Jonathan reached for his pocket watch. 3 a.m. He had slept for hours, yet felt utterly drained. A noise caught his attention, a soft scraping from somewhere beyond his door. He listened intently. There it was again, followed by what sounded like a muffled whimper. Jonathan rose, fighting a wave of dizziness. Something was wrong. The stew, had there been something in it? He cursed his carelessness. As a federal investigator, he should have been more cautious. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he moved to the door. He pressed his ear against it, holding his breath. Footsteps passed by, heavy and slow, followed by what sounded like something being dragged. Silently, he opened the door just enough to peer into the hallway. A figure, Mrs. Harlow, he realized, was dragging a burlap sack toward the stairs leading to the third floor. The sack was large and oddly shaped, and appeared heavy from the way she struggled with it. Jonathan waited until she disappeared up the stairs before stepping into the hallway. His investigator's instincts overrode his caution. The two missing couriers had last been seen in this area. Could there be a connection? He moved quietly toward the staircase, grateful for the runner carpet that muffled his footsteps. From above came more scraping sounds, then a heavy thud. Jonathan ascended slowly, stopping whenever a stair threatened to creak. The third floor was darker than the second, with no windows in the narrow hallway. Jonathan paused, allowing his eyes to adjust. A thin line of light showed beneath the door at the far end. As he approached, he could hear Mrs. Harlow moving about, accompanied by metallic sounds like knives being sharpened or arranged. "Fresh one tonight," he heard her say, though he detected no other voice in response. "Tender. Been some time since we've had such quality." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He moved closer, careful to avoid the boards that might betray his presence. "The others are nearly ready," Mrs. Harlow continued. "Another day for the tall one. The fat one's prime now." A coppery smell seeped from beneath the door, sickeningly familiar to Jonathan from battlefields and crime scenes. Blood, and a great deal of it. He needed to see what was happening, but the keyhole was blocked from within. Beside the door, he noticed a small ventilation grate near the floor. Kneeling, he peered through it. What he saw made his gorge rise. The room beyond appeared to be a makeshift butchery. Large cuts of meat hung from hooks in the ceiling. On a table lay the burlap sack, now open, revealing what looked disturbingly like a human leg. Mrs. Harlow stood at a workbench, her back to the door, expertly cutting and sectioning pieces of dark red meat. She hummed softly as she worked, occasionally speaking to someone or something that remained out of Jonathan's limited view. "The special seasoning makes all the difference," she was saying. "Grandfather knew that. The meat needs preparation. Time to absorb the fear." Jonathan recoiled from the grate, his mind racing to make sense of what he was witnessing. The stew, the unique flavor, the missing travelers. Horror dawned as realization took hold. A floorboard creaked beneath his weight. Mrs. Harlow fell silent mid-sentence. "We have a curious guest, it seems," she said quietly. Jonathan didn't wait to hear more. He moved swiftly back toward the staircase, but his haste betrayed him. His foot crashed through a weak board, trapping him momentarily. The door at the end of the hall opened, spilling yellow light into the corridor. Mrs. Harlow stood silhouetted against it, a large cleaver in her hand. "Mr. Pierce," she called, her voice eerily calm. "You should be resting. The first dose often causes insomnia, but wandering is ill-advised." Jonathan wrenched his leg free and staggered toward the stairs. Behind him, Mrs. Harlow advanced unhurriedly, as if certain he couldn't escape. "You've only had a taste," she continued. "Not nearly enough to properly tenderize you. But no matter. Some meats are best when they've known true terror." Jonathan stumbled down the stairs, his mind clouded from whatever had been in the stew. He had to escape to find help. But as he reached the main floor, he realized a terrible truth. The storm still raged outside, and the nearest town was miles away through treacherous conditions. He was trapped at least until morning, and something told him Mrs. Harlow had no intention of letting him see the dawn. The main floor of the inn was shrouded in darkness, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. Jonathan crouched behind the bar, straining to hear Mrs. Harlow's movements. She descended the stairs with deliberate slowness, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. "Mr. Pierce," she called, her voice honeyed with false concern. "You're unwell. The journey, the cold, they've affected your mind. Come back upstairs and I'll prepare something to help you sleep." Jonathan remained silent, his hand closing around a heavy bottle on a lower shelf. A weapon, if needed. His eyes had adjusted enough to make out the inn's layout, the main door straight ahead, the kitchen to the right. Escape into the blizzard would likely mean freezing to death. He needed shelter, a place to hide until daylight. Mrs. Harlow reached the bottom of the stairs. "I know you're still here," she said, moving into the room. The cleaver gleamed dully in the faint light. "I can smell your fear." Jonathan noticed something then, a trapdoor behind the bar, partially concealed by a small rug. A cellar, perhaps. Without hesitation, he lifted it as quietly as possible and lowered himself into the darkness below. Easing the door closed above him, the cellar was pitch black and bitterly cold. Jonathan stood motionless, listening to Mrs. Harlow's footsteps overhead. The air carried a putrid stench that made his eyes water. Feeling along the wall, his fingers found a lantern and mercifully matches beside it. With hands shaking from cold and fear, he struck a match and lit the lantern, turning the wick low to emit minimal light. What the dim glow revealed made him nearly drop the lantern in horror. The cellar was a charnel house. 3 bodies hung from meat hooks driven into the ceiling beams, each in various stages of butchery. One was fresh enough that Jonathan recognized him, Mr. Tanner, who had left the inn earlier that evening. His chest cavity had been opened and partially emptied, fluids draining into a bucket below. Beyond them, shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved organs and what appeared to be cured meat. In the corner stood barrels labeled with names and dates, some going back decades. A ledger lay open on a small table. Jonathan approached it, his investigator's mind still functioning despite his terror. The book contained names, dates, and detailed notes. He recognized the names of the missing couriers, along with dozens of others. Beside each entry were notes about quality, flavor, and tenderizing methods. The final pieces fell into place. The Crossroads Inn wasn't merely the site of occasional murders. It was a long-established operation, a family business of sorts, harvesting human meat for some unthinkable purpose. A notation at the bottom of a page caught his eye. Grandfather's special preparation continues to improve results. Consuming the fearful yields the greatest benefits. 3 more should complete the ritual. The trapdoor above creaked. Jonathan extinguished the lantern instantly and pressed himself against the wall behind a row of hanging corpses. Light spilled into the cellar as the door opened fully. Mrs. Harlow descended the stairs, lantern in one hand, cleaver in the other. "You've discovered our little secret, Mr. Pierce," she said, scanning the darkness. "Most unfortunate, though I suppose it hardly matters now." She moved through the cellar with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the space. "This family has maintained the tradition for generations. My grandfather started it during the terrible winter of '94. Starvation has a way of expanding one's culinary horizons." Jonathan remained perfectly still, scarcely breathing. "But he discovered something remarkable," she continued, moving closer to where Jonathan hid. "The meat of men who died in fear had properties, special properties. Those who consumed it gained ... benefits, strength, longevity." She laughed softly. "Why, I'm 87 years old, Mr. Pierce. Do I look it?" The revelation struck Jonathan with fresh horror. He recalled the strange vitality in her movements, at odds with her apparent age. "The stable boy would have told you had you thought to ask. He's my son, born in 1791. She sighed. "We've tried using animals. It's not the same. Human fear creates something essential. And in these troubled times with war brewing, travelers are plentiful and rarely missed." She was directly before him now, separated only by the hanging corpse of Mr. Tanner. For a moment Jonathan thought she would move on, but then she smiled, looking directly at his hiding place. "There you are," she whispered. Jonathan lunged forward, shoving the corpse toward her. Mrs. Harlow stumbled backward, momentarily entangled with the dead weight. Gave Jonathan the opening he needed. He bolted for the stairs. Behind him, Mrs. Harlow recovered with inhuman quickness. "You can't escape," she hissed, her voice changing, deepening, losing its human quality. "None of them ever do." Jonathan reached the trapdoor and burst through it, emerging behind the bar. Dawn was approaching. Faint gray light showed through the windows. The storm had subsided. If he could reach his horse. He raced for the main door, throwing it open. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it after the charnel reek of the cellar. Fresh snow blanketed everything, pristine and unmarked. "Mr. Pierce." The voice came not from behind him, but from the stable. The boy stood there, holding Jonathan's saddled horse. His face, visible in the growing light, bore the same features as Mrs. Harlow, though his eyes held something far older. "Mother says you're leaving us," the boy said, his voice carrying the same unplaceable accent as Mrs. Harlow's. "That's a shame. We so rarely get federal agents here." Jonathan froze, realizing the trap had been waiting all along. "How did you know?" Jonathan asked, buying time as he assessed his options. His pistol was in his saddlebags. On the horse the boy held. The boy's smile was disconcertingly adult. Union couriers disappear, and suddenly a well-dressed man with government bearing arrives asking questions. It wasn't difficult to surmise. From behind Jonathan came Mrs. Harlow's voice, calm once more. "Samuel, bring Mr. Pierce's horse closer. It's impolite to make our guest shout." "Yes, mother." The boy Samuel led the horse forward through the snow. Jonathan noticed now what he had missed before. The unnatural smoothness of the boy's movements, the ancient knowledge in his eyes. No 14-year-old moved or spoke that way. "Your colleagues passed through 2 weeks ago," Mrs. Harlow said, coming to stand beside Jonathan. The cleaver was gone, replaced by a small ornate pistol pointed casually at his back. They carried interesting documents. Military movements, supply routes, valuable to certain parties. You sold the information, Jonathan realized. This isn't just about consumption. Business diversification, she replied with a shrug. The war presents opportunities. But don't worry, your colleagues contributed to our primary enterprise as well. The younger one was particularly flavorful. Jonathan's gaze darted around the property. The inn stood isolated, surrounded by untouched snow. No witnesses, no help. His only advantage was daylight and the cessation of the storm. You won't reach the next town, Samuel said, reading his thoughts. 10 miles through snow this deep? You'd collapse from exhaustion before making half the distance. And then we'd simply collect you, Mrs. Harlow added. Much easier than pursuit. Jonathan had faced dangerous situations throughout his career, but never one so horrific or seemingly hopeless. Yet something didn't fit. They were talking too much, delaying. Why not simply kill him in the cellar? The documents, he said suddenly, you haven't sold them yet. You're waiting for your buyer. A flicker of annoyance crossed Mrs. Harlow's face. Clever man. Yes, our Confederate friend arrives today. He pays well for Union secrets, and he's never questioned our stew's unique flavor. He's due by noon, Samuel added. We need you secured before then. The last federal agent's disappearance has already drawn attention. Yours must appear unrelated. An unfortunate accident, Mrs. Harlow explained. Your horse spooked by a snake, throwing you down a ravine. Your body won't be found until spring thaw, if ever. Jonathan measured the distance to his horse. Samuel held the reins loosely, confidently. The boy might appear young, but Jonathan suspected he possessed the same unnatural strength as his mother. What about the others? Jonathan asked. The locals who disappear? Travelers pass through frequently this time of year, Mrs. Harlow said. Some continue their journeys. Some contribute to our larder. The ledger determines who goes where. And the town? Surely people notice. Samuel laughed, a chilling sound from such a youthful face. We are the town, Mr. Pierce. The few families in the valley are all relations. All partake of the benefits. A community of cannibals, Jonathan whispered. A family with special dietary requirements, Mrs. Harlow corrected. Now, enough conversation. Samuel, secure his hands. The boy moved forward, producing rope from his pocket. Jonathan tensed, preparing for his one chance. As Samuel reached for his wrists, Jonathan drove his knee upward into the boy's stomach. Samuel doubled over. Not from pain, Jonathan realized with horror, but from laughter. Mother said you'd fight, he wheezed, straightening with unnatural speed. His hand closed around Jonathan's wrist with crushing force. They always do. A gunshot cracked through the clear morning air. Samuel's grip loosened as surprise registered on his face. A bloom of red appeared on his chest. Mrs. Harlow screamed, a sound of rage rather than grief. Jonathan spun to see her raising her pistol, no longer pointed at him but at someone behind him. A second shot rang out. Mrs. Harlow staggered backward, dropping her weapon. Blood spread across her bodice, but she remained standing, her face contorted with inhuman fury. Federal agents, came a shout. Drop your weapons. Jonathan turned to see 3 men on horseback emerging from the tree line, rifles raised. He recognized the lead rider, Agent Thornton from the Washington office. Pierce. Are you injured? Thornton called. Behind you, Jonathan shouted as Samuel, seemingly unaffected by his wound, lunged toward him with unnatural speed. 2 more shots dropped the boy to his knees, but still he crawled forward, reaching for Jonathan with clawed hands. Mrs. Harlow let out an inhuman howl and charged toward the agents. Her movements were jerky, almost insectal in their speed. 2 of the agents fired, the bullets striking her squarely in the chest. She faltered but didn't fall. The head? Jonathan yelled, diving for Mrs. Harlow's dropped pistol. Shoot for the head. Thornton adjusted his aim and fired. The back of Mrs. Harlow's skull exploded outward. She collapsed immediately, her body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. Samuel screamed, a sound that started human but warped into something bestial. The agents converged on him, firing repeatedly until he finally lay still in the blood-stained snow. Silence descended, broken only by the snorting of nervous horses. Thornton dismounted and approached Jonathan cautiously. What in God's name were they? Jonathan stared at the bodies. Already a strange transformation was occurring. Mrs. Harlow's skin was wrinkling, withering like fruit left in the sun. Samuel's youthful features were aging rapidly, the flesh shrinking against the skull. I'm not sure, Jonathan said truthfully, but there are more in the valley. A whole community. We know, Thornton said grimly, that's why we're here. When you missed your rendezvous, we accelerated the investigation. A settlement this small shouldn't have so many disappearances. The other agents were approaching the inn cautiously, weapons ready. "There's evidence inside," Jonathan told them. "In the cellar, and documents, information sold to the Confederacy." Thornton nodded. "We'll handle it." He hesitated. "The reports mention rumors about the food served here. Something about a special stew, double quotes." Jonathan looked at the rapidly mummifying corpses. "I wouldn't recommend it," he said quietly. The federal agents worked methodically through the Crossroads Inn, documenting every grisly discovery with professional detachment that belied their horror. The cellar yielded 5 additional bodies in various states of butchery, along with preservation equipment that suggested a long-established operation. Jonathan sat wrapped in a blanket near the fireplace, a cup of untouched coffee before him. He couldn't bring himself to consume anything prepared in that kitchen. "The documents were exactly where you said," Thornton reported, sitting across from him. "Military communications, supply routes, troop movements, all intended for Confederate intelligence. The buyer's identity was in Mrs. Harlow's ledger. A Colonel James Blackwood due to arrive today. Will you wait for him?" Jonathan asked. Thornton nodded. "2 agents are positioned on the road. The rest of us will search the other properties in the valley. According to our information, there are 7 households within a 5-mile radius." Jonathan stared into the fire. "They're all involved. The boy Samuel," he said, "the entire community partakes of the ... benefits." "What exactly are these benefits?" Thornton asked, lowering his voice, though the other agents were out of earshot. "Longevity, strength. Mrs. Harlow claimed to be 87 years old. Said the boy was born in 1791. Thornton's expression remained neutral, but Jonathan saw the flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You saw how they reacted to being shot," Jonathan pressed. "No human could absorb that much damage and continue fighting." "I saw," Thornton admitted, "though I'm not prepared to accept supernatural explanations. Perhaps a chemical compound in the ... meat creates a stimulant effect. Numbs pain, increases strength." Jonathan didn't argue. The truth was too fantastic, and he wasn't certain he fully believed it himself. Yet the image of Mrs. Harlow's rapidly aging corpse was burned into his memory. "We found something else," Thornton continued, producing a small leather-bound book from his pocket. "This was hidden beneath the floorboards in Mrs. Harlow's room. It appears to be a journal." Jonathan accepted it gingerly. The leather was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was precise but archaic in style, dating to the late 18th century based on Jonathan's experience with historical documents. "It belonged to Abraham Harlow," Thornton explained, "apparently Mrs. Harlow's grandfather. The first entries date to 1794, during a particularly harsh winter." Jonathan carefully turned the pages, reading passages that confirmed Mrs. Harlow's account. Abraham Harlow had been a frontier doctor who, faced with starvation during a blizzard, had resorted to cannibalism, first consuming those who had already died from cold and hunger, then actively hunting survivors. But the journal documented something more disturbing: Harlow's methodical experimentation with preparation methods, his observation of the effects, and his growing obsession with the transformative properties of human meat harvested from subjects experiencing extreme terror. "He believed fear changed the meat at a fundamental level," Jonathan murmured. "Created something he called the essence." The later entries became increasingly deranged, describing rituals involving specific organs and bodily fluids, precise aging periods for different cuts of meat, and the communion that bound his growing family to the practice. "The final entry is dated 1831, Thornton noted. "By then, the Crossroads Inn was established as a way station for travelers heading west. A perfect trapping ground." Jonathan closed the journal, unable to read more. "And this continued for decades, generations. With no one the wiser," Thornton agreed grimly. "Travelers disappear in frontier territories all the time. Accidents, weather, bandits. Easier to accept those explanations than ... this." From outside came the sound of approaching riders. Thornton rose, checking his weapon. "That will be Stevens and Cooper returning from the Milner property, one of the other households in the valley." The door opened, and Agent Stevens entered, his face ashen beneath his beard. "Empty," he reported. "Recently abandoned, it appears. But we found a root cellar. Same as here. Preservation equipment. Remains." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. There was a child's dress hanging on one of the meat hooks. The implications turned Jonathan's stomach. They're preparing for war, he realized. More travelers, more soldiers passing through, more opportunities to harvest. If what you say about this preservation method is true, the entire community could be implicated, Thornton said. "We need to locate all of them." Agent Cooper appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. Riders approaching from the south. 5 men, heavily armed. "One matches the description of Colonel Blackwood." Thornton nodded. "Positions, gentlemen. Let's welcome the colonel properly." As the agents moved to their hiding places, Jonathan remained by the fire, the ancient journal in his hands. The questions it raised were too disturbing to contemplate fully. How many similar operations might exist in isolated communities across the frontier? How long had this been happening? And most troubling, what exactly had the Harlows and their kin become through decades of their monstrous diet? He placed the journal in the fire, watching as the yellowed pages blackened and curled. Some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. Yet as the flames consumed Abraham Harlow's secrets, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of a horror that had taken root in Kentucky. Valley long ago, a horror that might not be fully extinguished by fire, bullets, or the light of day. Colonel James Blackwood cut an imposing figure as he entered the Crossroads Inn, tall and broad-shouldered. His Confederate gray uniform immaculate despite his journey, he carried himself with military precision. 4 men flanked him, not soldiers in uniform but hard-faced civilians armed with pistols and rifles. "Mrs. Harlow?" Blackwood called, removing his hat as he surveyed the seemingly empty main room. His eyes fell on Jonathan, still seated by the fire. "You're not the usual welcoming committee." "Mrs. Harlow is indisposed," Jonathan replied evenly. "Permanently so." Understanding dawned in Blackwood's eyes. He made a subtle gesture, and his men spread out, hands moving toward their weapons. "Federal agents." Thornton's voice rang out as he and 3 other agents emerged from their hiding places, rifles aimed. "Drop your weapons." For a tense moment no one moved. Blackwood's eyes darted around the room, calculating odds that were clearly not in his favor. "Colonel James Blackwood," Thornton continued, "you are under arrest for espionage, treason against the United States, and conspiracy with—" The crash of gunfire interrupted him as one of Blackwood's men drew and fired in a single motion. The agent nearest Jonathan collapsed with a cry, blood blossoming on his shirt. Chaos erupted. Thornton and the remaining agents returned fire as Blackwood and his men scattered, seeking cover behind overturned tables in the bar. Jonathan dove to the floor, crawling toward the wounded agent who had fallen nearby. The man was alive but bleeding heavily from a chest wound. Jonathan dragged him behind a large cabinet, trying to shield him from the continuing gunfire. "Hold on," he urged, pressing his handkerchief against the wound. "Help is coming." Through the cacophony of gunshots and shouting, Jonathan became aware of a new sound, pounding at the rear door of the inn. More Blackwood's men or something worse. The door splintered inward. Silhouetted against the winter light stood 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, dressed in the rough clothing of rural farmers. Their faces bore familiar features, the same distinctive bone structure as Mrs. Harlow and Samuel. "The family," Jonathan whispered. Thornton had seen them too. "Pierce. Back door." One of the agents pivoted to fire at the newcomers, but the woman moved with the same unnatural speed Jonathan had witnessed in Mrs. Harlow. She closed the distance. Before the agent could pull the trigger, grabbing his rifle and wrenching it away with impossible strength, Blackwood, momentarily forgotten in the new threat, seized the opportunity. "Kill them all," he ordered his men. The main room of the inn became a killing floor. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Blackwood's men engaged both the federal agents and the Harlow kin, who seemed to absorb bullets with minimal effect. Jonathan had no weapon, but the wounded agent pressed a revolver into his hand. "Don't let them take me alive," he gasped, having apparently grasped the nature of their inhuman adversaries. One of the Harlow men charged toward Jonathan's position, moving in that same jerky, too-fast manner. Jonathan raised the revolver and aimed for the head, remembering how Mrs. Harlow had finally fallen. He squeezed the trigger, but the bullet merely grazed his attacker's temple. The man staggered but didn't fall. Blood trickled down his face as his lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "Federal dog," he hissed, reaching for Jonathan. A shotgun blast from across the room took the man full in the face, removing most of his head. The body collapsed, twitching. Thornton lowered the smoking shotgun and nodded grimly toward Jonathan before turning to engage another threat. Colonel Blackwood, meanwhile, was experiencing the horror of his former business partners firsthand. The Harlow woman had cornered one of his men and was literally tearing him apart with her bare hands. Oblivious to the bullets he fired into her torso. "What are these devils?" Blackwood shouted, backing toward the main door. The remaining Harlow man answered by charging directly at the colonel. Blackwood emptied his revolver into his attacker's chest, but the man kept coming, tackling him to the floor. Jonathan watched in horror as the Harlow creature lowered his head and tore out Blackwood's throat with his teeth. The tide of battle shifted rapidly after that. Blackwood's remaining men, faced with enemies that wouldn't die by conventional means, attempted to flee. None made it to the door. The 2 Harlow creatures, despite grievous wounds, moved with predatory efficiency, cutting down their prey. The federal agents fared better, having witnessed what killed Mrs. Harlow and Samuel. Baljams really reverbore bloods. Only Thornton, Jonathan, and one other agent remained standing. The wounded man Jonathan had been protecting had died during the firefight. What happened to the third one? Jonathan asked, scanning the carnage for the second Harlow man. Thornton cursed. Must have slipped away during the chaos. The surviving agent checked the bodies, confirming what they already knew. All of Blackwood's men are dead. 2 of these, whatever they are, confirmed dead as well. Jonathan approached one of the fallen Harlow creatures, the woman. Already her body was undergoing the same rapid aging he had witnessed with Mrs. Harlow and Samuel, the skin shriveling and pulling tight against the bones. "We need to burn this place to the ground," he said quietly. "All of it. The inn, the bodies, everything." Thornton didn't argue. "So Richards, bring the lamp oil from the stable. All of it." As the agent hurried to comply, Jonathan retrieved Abraham Harlow's journal from where he had hidden it rather than burning it earlier. Some evidence needed to survive, no matter how disturbing. "There's still one out there," he reminded Thornton, "and possibly others in the valley. We'll hunt them down," Thornton promised. "Every last one. But first we eliminate any trace of this." He gestured to the bodies of the Harlow creatures. "No one can know what happened here. The official report will state that Confederate spies were operating from this location. Nothing more," Jonathan understood. The truth was too fantastic, too horrific for public consumption. Even their superiors in Washington might question their sanity if they reported cannibalistic, near-immortal beings operating an inn in Kentucky. As flames consumed the Crossroads Inn, Jonathan, Thornton, and Agent Richards watched from a safe distance. Black smoke billowed against the winter sky, carrying the stench of burning flesh that made their eyes water. "That should destroy most of the evidence," Thornton said grimly. "What we can't explain, at least." The Confederate documents had been secured, along with Mrs. Harlow's ledger and Abraham Harlow's journal. Everything else would be reduced to ash, including the bodies of their fallen comrades. An unfortunate necessity, Jonathan knew, to prevent questions about the true nature of their wounds. "We need to move quickly," he urged. "The remaining Harlow and any others in the valley will know what's happened by now." Thornton nodded. "Richards, ride back to the junction and bring the reinforcements waiting there. We'll need every man to sweep this valley properly." As Richards mounted and rode off, Thornton turned to Jonathan. "You're not officially under my command, Pierce. You've done your duty locating the missing couriers. No one would blame you for riding out with Richards." Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on the burning building. "I started this. I'll see it finished." The truth was, he couldn't leave, not with the knowledge that more of these creatures might exist in the surrounding area. The image of the child's dress Stevens had found hanging on a meat hook haunted him. How many innocent travelers had met their end in this valley? How many more would suffer if they didn't eliminate the threat entirely? "We have approximately 3 hours of daylight left," Thornton calculated. "Not enough time to wait for reinforcements if we want to prevent any escapes. The valley has limited exit points," Jonathan noted. "The main road north and south, and possibly a mountain pass to the east that might be navigable on foot." "We'll need to check every property between here and those exit points," Thornton agreed. Starting with the closest, the Miller farm, about a mile west. They collected weapons from their fallen comrades and mounted their horses. As they rode away, Jonathan glanced back at the inn one last time. The roof had collapsed inward, sparks shooting skyward. Whatever secrets the Crossroads Inn had held for decades were being purified by fire. The Miller farm came into view after 20 minutes of hard riding. Unlike the relatively well-maintained inn, the farmhouse was dilapidated, its windows dark and empty. A barn stood nearby, door slightly ajar. No smoke from the chimney, Thornton observed. No tracks in the fresh snow except those leading away toward the south. Jonathan dismounted, drawing his revolver. "Recently abandoned, then?" "We should check anyway," Thornton replied, following suit. "You take the house, I'll check the barn." The farmhouse door hung from a single hinge, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. Jonathan pushed it open, weapon raised. The interior was sparse, a table overturned, chairs broken as if in haste or struggle. The fireplace contained only cold ashes. Moving cautiously through the small house, Jonathan noted signs of hurried departure, drawers left open, clothes scattered. In what appeared to be a bedroom, he found a small portrait of a family, a stern-faced man, a woman with Mrs. Harlow's distinctive features, and 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a girl no more than 7. 4 more potential threats unaccounted for. A noise from below caught his attention, a soft thud, as if something had fallen or been dropped. Jonathan froze, listening intently. There it was again, movement beneath the floorboards. A cellar like at the inn. He located the trapdoor in the kitchen, partially concealed beneath a rug. Drawing a deep breath, he grabbed the iron ring and pulled it open in one swift motion, stepping back with his revolver aimed at the dark opening. "Federal agent!" he called. "Come up with your hands visible!" Silence greeted him, then a small sound, something between a whimper and a sob. "I won't ask again," Jonathan warned, though doubt crept into his mind. The sound had seemed almost childlike. "Please don't shoot," came a tremulous voice. "I'm coming up." A pair of small hands appeared at the edge of the opening, followed by the tear-streaked face of a young girl, the same one from the portrait, though thinner and paler now. "You alone down there?" Jonathan asked, not lowering his weapon despite his instinct to do so. He had seen how deceptive these creatures could be. The girl nodded, climbing fully into the kitchen. She wore a simple dress, dirty and torn at the hem. Her eyes darted nervously around the room. "What's your name?" Jonathan kept his distance, studying her for any sign of the unnatural movement he'd witnessed in the others. "Mary Miller," she whispered. "Are you going to kill me like you killed the others?" The question caught Jonathan off guard. "I'm not here to harm innocent people," he said carefully. "But I need you to tell me the truth. Where is your family?" "Pa took Ma and Robert away this morning. Said bad men were coming." Her lower lip trembled. "They left me behind because I wouldn't eat the special food anymore. Said I was weak." Jonathan's grip on his revolver tightened. "The special food? You mean the stew?" Mary nodded, her eyes downcast. "Everyone has to eat it. Pa says it makes us strong, but it tastes bad, and I saw what they do to make it." Tears welled in her eyes. "They hurt people, cut them up. I told Pa I didn't want to anymore, and he got real mad." "How old are you, Mary?" Jonathan asked, though he dreaded the answer. 12, she replied. The portrait had shown a girl of 7 at most. Yet another confirmation of the unnatural effects of the Harlow's diet. "Where did your family go?" Jonathan pressed. "The meeting place, where everyone goes when there's trouble." Her eyes widened suddenly, looking past Jonathan. "Behind you," Jonathan spun, bringing up his revolver, but too late. A massive figure filled the doorway, the missing Harlow man from the inn, blood still caking his shirt from multiple bullet wounds. Before Jonathan could fire, the man charged with that same inhuman speed, knocking the weapon from his hand and sending him crashing into the kitchen table. Pain exploded in Jonathan's ribs as he struggled to his feet. The Harlow creature advanced, lips peeled back in a feral grin. "You burn our home," he growled. "Kill our kin. Now you'll feed us, federal man." Jonathan backed away, searching desperately for a weapon. His hand closed around a cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall. Not much against a creature that could absorb multiple gunshots, but better than nothing. "Mary, run," he shouted, swinging the skillet at his attacker's head. The Harlow man caught it mid-swing with disturbing ease, wrenching it from Jonathan's grasp and tossing it aside. His hand closed around Jonathan's throat, lifting him off his feet with terrible strength. "The girl stays," the man snarled. "She needs to learn our ways. Watch what happens to those who threaten the family." Jonathan struggled for air, kicking ineffectually at his attacker. Darkness crept at the edges of his vision as the creature's grip tightened. A deafening blast filled the small kitchen. The Harlow man's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone, his grip releasing instantly. Jonathan fell to the floor, gasping for breath as the headless body collapsed beside him. Thornton stood in the doorway, shotgun still smoking. "You all right, Pierce?" Jonathan nodded, massaging his bruised throat. "The girl," he croaked, looking around. Mary huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror, staring at the rapidly decomposing body of her attacker. "Who was he?" Thornton asked her gently, lowering the shotgun. "Uncle John," she whispered. "Pa's brother." Thornton and Jonathan exchanged grim looks. The family connections in the valley ran deep, it seemed. "Mary," Jonathan said, approaching her slowly. "You mentioned a meeting place where everyone goes when there's trouble. Can you tell us where that is?" The girl hesitated, conflict evident on her young face. Finally she nodded. "It's the old church," she said. "In the caves." The limestone caves were located 3 miles south of the Miller farm, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense forest before disappearing into the mountainside. Mary rode with Jonathan, directing them through terrain she clearly knew well. "How many people will be there?" Thornton asked as they dismounted and prepared to continue on foot. "Everyone," Mary replied, "all the families. Pa says there's 23 of us now. 23 cannibalistic, near-immortal beings with inhuman strength." Jonathan checked his weapons. A revolver with 5 remaining bullets and a hunting knife. Thornton carried the shotgun with limited shells and his service pistol. They were dangerously outmatched. "Richards and the reinforcements won't arrive for hours," Thornton murmured, clearly thinking the same. "We should wait. They could scatter by then," Jonathan countered. "Or worse, they might have captives." The girl had been quiet, but now she spoke up. "They have 2 soldiers. Caught them yesterday. That settled it. They couldn't wait." "Mary, I need you to stay here with the horses," Jonathan instructed. "If we're not back by nightfall, take my horse and ride north until you reach the junction. Tell anyone in uniform what happened." The girl looked frightened but nodded. Something in her eyes, a weariness no child should possess, told Jonathan she understood the gravity of the situation. "How far into the caves is this church?" Thornton asked as they checked their weapons one final time. "Not far," Mary said. "You'll hear them before you see them. They'll be doing the communion." The cave entrance was unremarkable, a dark fissure in the limestone cliff face, barely wide enough for a man to pass through. Inside, the passage widened, sloping gently downward. Enough light filtered in from the entrance that they could navigate without lanterns, at least initially. "What exactly is the communion?" Jonathan asked quietly as they moved deeper. "I don't know for sure," Thornton replied, "but based on the journal, I'd guess it's some kind of ritual consumption. Sharing the special meat to bind the community together." The thought turned Jonathan's stomach, but he pressed on. The passage began to curve, and soon the daylight behind them faded. Thornton produced a small bullseye lantern from his pack, shielding most of its light to avoid detection. They had traveled perhaps 300 yards when Jonathan heard it, voices raised in what sounded like a guttural chant, echoing through the stone passages. The language was unfamiliar, but the rhythm was unmistakably ritualistic. "Close," Thornton whispered, extinguishing the lantern. They continued in darkness, guided by the voices and a faint glow that grew stronger as they approached. The passage opened suddenly into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. Jonathan and Thornton crouched behind a natural stone formation, taking in the scene before them. The church was a natural amphitheater within the cave, illuminated by dozens of torches set in iron brackets along the walls. Crude wooden pews faced a raised stone platform that served as an altar. Upon it stood a large iron cauldron, steam rising from its contents. Approximately 20 people, men, women, and children of varying ages, were arranged in a semicircle around the altar. All bore the distinctive features Jonathan had come to recognize. The same bone structure, the same unnatural vitality. A man Jonathan assumed was Miller, based on his resemblance to Mary, stood at the altar, ladling something from the cauldron into wooden bowls. Behind him, bound 2 stone pillars, were 2 men in Union blue, the captured soldiers Mary had mentioned. They were alive but clearly terrified, struggling against their bonds as Miller approached one with a long, curved knife. "We need to act now," Jonathan whispered urgently. Thornton nodded, checking the shotgun. "I'll create a diversion at the far entrance," he said, pointing to another passage visible across the chamber. "You free the prisoners while they're distracted." "There are too many," Jonathan protested. "We need a better plan." But Thornton was already moving, slipping away through the shadows to circle around the chamber. Jonathan cursed silently, checking his revolver. 5 bullets against 20 inhuman cannibals. The odds were suicidal. Yet as he watched Miller raise the knife to the soldier's chest, he knew they had no choice. Those men would die horrifically if they didn't intervene. A sudden commotion from the far passage drew everyone's attention. Thornton had created his diversion, and from the sounds of gunfire and shouts, it was more direct than Jonathan had expected. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jonathan sprinted toward the altar, staying low behind the pews. Miller and several others rushed toward the commotion, leaving the prisoners momentarily unguarded. Jonathan reached the first soldier, using his knife to cut through the ropes binding him. "Federal agent," he whispered. "Can you walk?" The soldier nodded, though his face was ashen. "They were going to cut out my heart while it was still beating," he said hoarsely. "Get to the main passage," Jonathan instructed, moving to free the second soldier. "Follow it out and look for a girl with the horses. Don't wait for us." The second soldier was in worse condition, barely conscious. Together with the first, Jonathan half-carried him toward the main passage. They had nearly reached it when a shout went up behind them. Jonathan turned to see Miller pointing in their direction, his face contorted with rage. "Go!" Jonathan urged the soldiers, drawing his revolver as several of the Harlequin broke away from the main group and charged toward them. The first shot took one in the face, dropping him instantly. The second struck another in the knee, slowing but not stopping him. Jonathan's third bullet missed entirely as his target moved with that uncanny speed. Then they were upon him. Jonathan emptied his remaining bullets into the nearest attacker, then used the empty revolver as a bludgeon, smashing it into another's face. It bought him only seconds before a powerful blow to his ribs sent him sprawling. Pain exploded in his side, at least 2 broken ribs, he guessed. Jonathan struggled to his feet, drawing his hunting knife as 3 of the creatures surrounded him, moving with predatory grace. "Take him alive!" Miller ordered, approaching from behind the others. "He'll be the centerpiece of our new communion." From across the chamber came the boom of Thornton's shotgun, followed by screams. The distraction gave Jonathan an opening. He lunged forward, driving his knife into the nearest attacker's eye. The man fell with an inhuman shriek as Jonathan yanked the blade free. Something struck Jonathan from behind, a fist or club, he couldn't tell. He staggered, vision blurring as hands grabbed him from multiple directions. The knife was wrenched from his grasp. "Bring him to the altar," Miller commanded. The ritual must be completed. Jonathan struggled weakly as they dragged him toward the stone platform. Through blurred vision, he could see Thornton across the chamber, backed against the wall and fighting desperately as several of the creatures closed in on him. They forced Jonathan onto the altar, pinning his arms and legs. Miller loomed over him, holding the ceremonial knife. "Your heart will strengthen us," Miller intoned. "Your fear will nourish us." He raised the blade high, preparing to plunge it into Jonathan's chest. Jonathan strained against his captors, knowing it was futile but refusing to die without resistance. The knife began its downward arc, and then stopped as Miller's expression changed to one of confusion. He looked down at his chest, where a small red spot had appeared on his shirt, spreading rapidly. A second shot rang out, and another, and another. Miller staggered backward, dropping the knife. More gunfire erupted from the main passage, disciplined volleys that cut down the creatures one by one. "Federal agents!" came a shout that Jonathan recognized as Richard's voice. "Drop your weapons!" The reinforcements had arrived. The arrival of 24 heavily armed federal agents turned the tide instantly. Though the Harlow-kin fought with inhuman ferocity, they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The agents, forewarned about the creature's resistance to conventional wounds, aimed for headshots, dropping them systematically. Jonathan, released by his captors as they turned to face the new threat, rolled off the altar and took cover behind it. His body screamed in protest, ribs grinding together painfully, but survival instinct kept him moving. Across the chamber, he spotted Thornton breaking free from his attackers as they fell to concentrated rifle fire. Their eyes met briefly, an acknowledgement that they had both somehow survived against impossible odds. The battle was short but brutal. The gunfire finally ceased. 18 of the Harlow-kin lay dead, their bodies already beginning the strange, accelerated decomposition Jonathan had witnessed before. 5 agents were injured, 2 critically, but none had been killed. Richards approached Jonathan, helping him to his feet. "Apologies for the late arrival," he said grimly. "We encountered resistance at a farmhouse 2 miles back." "The 2 soldiers?" Jonathan asked, clutching his side. "Safe. We found them with the girl hiding in the woods." Richards surveyed the carnage around them. What in God's name were these people? Before Jonathan could answer, Thornton joined them, bleeding from a gash on his forehead but otherwise intact. "The official report will say Confederate sympathizers," Thornton said firmly, "armed and dangerous. Resisted arrest." Richards looked skeptical but nodded. "And the unofficial reality?" Thornton exchanged glances with Jonathan. Something better left buried in these caves. As medics tended to the wounded, other agents began the grim task of gathering the bodies. Following Thornton's orders, they would be burned, leaving no evidence of the Harlow family's true nature. Jonathan sat on a rock outcropping, wincing as a medic wrapped his ribs. "What about the girl?" he asked Thornton. "Mary?" "That's a difficult question," Thornton admitted. "She's one of them, technically, but she rejected their practices at great personal risk. She said she stopped eating the special food," Jonathan recalled. "Maybe that means she can still live a normal life." Thornton considered this. "We'll place her with a family far from here. Monitor her development. If she shows any concerning traits, we'll deal with that when the time comes." Jonathan nodded, though the solution felt incomplete. Mary was both victim and potential threat, an innocent child who might harbor inhuman capabilities. "And the valley?" he asked. "Will be cleansed," Thornton replied. "Every structure burned, every trace of what happened here eliminated. The official record will show a Confederate spy network was discovered and neutralized." "And Abraham Harlow's journal?" Thornton patted his breast pocket. "For Washington's eyes only. Some secrets are too dangerous for public knowledge." As they prepared to leave the caves, Jonathan took a final look at the macabre church. The iron cauldron still stood on the altar, its contents cooling, the communion that would never be completed. He wondered how long the Harlow family's ritual had continued, how many generations had perpetuated this horror, and whether they had truly eliminated it entirely. The reinforcements had been thorough, but doubt lingered. Had every member of the family been accounted for? Were there others, perhaps in different valleys, different states, practicing the same abominable tradition? These questions would haunt him in the days to come, but for now, there was only the relief of survival and the grim satisfaction of having stopped the immediate threat. "Let's get out of here," he said to Thornton. "I've lost my taste for Kentucky hospitality." 3 months later, Washington, D.C. The official report on what became known as the Kentucky Valley Incident filled just 3 pages. It documented the discovery and elimination of a Confederate spy ring operating out of Crossroads Inn. the recovery of stolen military documents, and the neutralization of 23 armed conspirators. The 2 missing couriers were listed as casualties, their bodies unrecoverable due to enemy action. No mention was made of cannibalism, ritual consumption, or beings with unnatural abilities. Those details existed only in a separate document sealed by direct order of President Lincoln himself, to be opened only in the event of similar incidents arising in the future. Jonathan Pierce sat in a small office at the War Department, completing his final statement on the affair. His ribs had healed, though they still ached in cold weather, a reminder he suspected would remain with him for life. A knock at the door interrupted his writing. Thornton entered, looking more careworn than when Jonathan had last seen him 6 weeks earlier. "Pierce," he greeted, closing the door behind him. "Good to see you recovered." "Mostly," Jonathan replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "What brings you to Washington? I thought you were overseeing operations in Pennsylvania." Thornton sat heavily, placing a leather portfolio on the desk between them. "I was... until this crossed my desk yesterday." He opened the portfolio, revealing a newspaper clipping from a small town in western Pennsylvania. The headline read, "Local tavern known for unique stew." Jonathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with his healing ribs. "It could be coincidence," he said, though he didn't believe it. "Perhaps," Thornton conceded. "But 3 travelers have disappeared in the area in the past month." The tavern's proprietor is a widow named Sarah Milligan. She arrived in the town last December, shortly after our operation in Kentucky. Description? Matches none of the Harlow women we encountered. But ... double, quotes Thornton hesitated. "According to locals, she's accompanied by her daughter, a girl of about 13. Mary," Jonathan whispered. "We don't know that," Thornton cautioned, "but I've dispatched agents to investigate discreetly." Jonathan stared at the clipping, remembering Mary's tear-streaked face as she guided them to the caves. Had it all been an act? Had she returned to her family's ways once removed from their supervision? "There's more," Thornton continued. "I've been reviewing unsolved disappearances along major travel routes for the past 50 years. There's a pattern, clusters of missing persons centered around remote inns, taverns, and roadhouses. Never enough to draw significant attention, but consistent." The implication was clear. The Harlow family's practices might not have been unique. Others might exist, scattered across the frontier, practicing the same dark rituals, gaining the same unnatural benefits. Abraham Harlow's journal mentioned others, Jonathan recalled. References to kindred souls and fellow travelers on the path. "I assumed it was the ravings of a madman." "Perhaps not," Thornton said grimly. "The President has authorized the creation of a special division within the War Department, ostensibly to track Confederate espionage networks, but with a true purpose known only to a select few." He slid a folded document across the desk. "Your transfer orders, if you're willing. The work would be ... challenging, often disturbing, but necessary." Jonathan opened the orders, scanning the bureaucratic language that disguised the unit's true purpose. He thought of the Crossroads Inn, of the horror in the caves, of Mary Miller, and the possibility that she represented a continuing threat. Someone needed to stand vigilant against such horrors. Someone who had seen the truth and survived to tell of it, however limited the audience. "When do I start?" he asked, signing the orders. Thornton's expression was grim but satisfied. "We leave for Pennsylvania tomorrow. Pack light, but bring weapons. If our suspicions are correct, this is just the beginning." As Jonathan gathered his belongings that evening, he found himself thinking of Mrs. Harlow's words on that snowy night months ago. "The meat needs preparation, time to absorb the fear." He had learned to absorb his own fear, to use it as fuel rather than paralysis. Whatever awaited in Pennsylvania, whether Mary Miller turned predator or some new horror altogether, he would face it with clear eyes and steady hands. For while the official records might be sanitized and sealed, Jonathan Pierce carried the truth within him, a burden and a responsibility. The Crossroads Inn was ashes, but its legacy lived on in dark corners of the nation, in secret kitchens where special stews simmered, in communities bound by communion of the most terrible kind. And he would find them one by one, until no traveler need fear what might await at the next welcoming light in the wilderness.